He walked into the courtroom already judged before he spoke a single word. His clothes were simple, his posture calm, but the smirk on the lawyer's face said everything. To them, he was just another uneducated black defendant who didn't belong in that room. Every glance carried doubt, every moment tightened the air with quiet humiliation. What no one realized was that this case was about to expose something far bigger than one man on trial. And when the truth finally surfaced, it would leave the entire courtroom frozen in silence. And before you hear what really happened, take a moment to think about this. If you've ever felt judged before being heard or misunderstood before being known, stay with this story, because it speaks to more than just one courtroom. Before that day in court, his life was quiet, structured, and almost invisible to the world around him. He believed in routine because it meant stability. Each morning started early, long before sunrise, with discipline carved into every habit. He worked hard, kept his head down, and avoided attention, knowing too well how easily attention could turn dangerous. To strangers, he looked ordinary. To some, he looked forgettable. To others, he looked like someone easy to dismiss. He had grown up learning that respect was not freely given to people who looked like him. It had to be earned twice over, sometimes 3 times, and even then it could be taken away in an instant. Still, he carried himself with quiet confidence, shaped by years of responsibility most people would never see. His past was full of sacrifice, long nights, and decisions that demanded absolute loyalty and discipline, but none of that showed on the surface. The incident that brought him into that courtroom seemed small at first. A misunderstanding. A routine stop. The kind of situation that was supposed to resolve itself quickly if you stayed calm and followed the rules. Instead, it escalated with unsettling speed. Paperwork piled up. Assumptions were made. Labels were quietly attached to his name before he ever had the chance to explain himself. By the time he stood before the court, the narrative had already been written for him. To those watching, he wasn't a man with a history, values, or purpose. He was a stereotype wrapped in a case file. And as the proceedings began, one thing became painfully clear. This was never just about the law. It was about who they believed he was, and who they never imagined he could be. As the case moved forward, the tone inside the courtroom shifted from routine to quietly hostile. Every motion felt rehearsed, every glance loaded with judgment. The paperwork painted him as careless, unprepared, and incapable of understanding the weight of the charges against him. Small details were exaggerated. Context was stripped away. What remained was a version of him that fit neatly into an assumption many in that room were already comfortable believing. The lawyer's confidence grew with each passing moment. The facts were presented quickly and selectively, as if the outcome had already been decided. The implication was clear. This man did not belong here as an equal participant in the process. He was treated as someone to be managed, corrected, and ultimately dismissed. The subtle disrespect became harder to ignore. It showed in the pacing, in the rushed summaries, and in the way his presence was minimized without a single word needing to be spoken. If this moment is hitting close to home, you're not alone. Stories like this don't stay on the screen, they live in real experiences. And that's why it matters that you keep watching what happens next, because this is where assumptions begin to crack. He stood calmly through it all, though his silence was misread. To some, it looked like confusion. To others, it looked like submission. No one considered that it might be restraint. Years of discipline had taught him when to speak and when to wait. But patience in that room only seemed to reinforce the false narrative forming around him. As the proceedings continued, the assumptions grew bolder. His education was quietly questioned. His ability to understand legal language was underestimated. The idea that he could challenge what was happening never crossed their minds. The imbalance of power was palpable, and the air felt heavier with every passing minute. This was not just a legal process unfolding. It was a demonstration of how easily dignity could be stripped away when bias went unchecked. Outside the courtroom, his life continued to hang in the balance. A conviction would mean more than consequences on paper. It would erase years of work, sacrifice, and service that no one here had bothered to ask about. The stakes were enormous, yet the room treated them as insignificant. He was reduced to a case number, a problem to be resolved quickly and quietly. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A procedural step most people barely noticed. A pause that lingered just a second longer than expected. Something in the rhythm of the case changed. The confidence on one side of the room no longer felt unshakable. The narrative that had been pushed so aggressively began to strain under its own weight. Those paying close attention could sense it. The assumptions had gone too far. The shortcuts were about to be exposed. What had started as a display of control was now teetering on the edge of embarrassment. The very traits they had dismissed as weakness were about to reveal themselves as something else entirely. The tension reached a breaking point. The room was no longer simply watching a case unfold. It was standing on the edge of a revelation. And if you're still here, watching this moment unfold, you already know, this is the part where everything changes. The moment arrived without warning, not with raised voices or dramatic gestures, but with a shift in energy so sharp it felt physical. The room that had leaned against him suddenly leaned back. The confidence that had dominated the proceedings faltered, replaced by an uneasy pause that no one could ignore. Papers were reviewed again. Eyes scanned details that had been overlooked on purpose just minutes earlier. What followed was not loud, but it was devastating. The record they had dismissed revealed itself as undeniable. The assumptions collapsed under the weight of verified truth. His background, once treated as irrelevant, now stood at the center of the case like an immovable object. Years of service, clearance, responsibility, and trust granted at the highest levels surfaced all at once. The narrative they had built unraveled in real time. The humiliation shifted sides. Faces tightened. The earlier smirk vanished, replaced by disbelief and quiet panic. The courtroom, once heavy with judgment, now held its breath. Every shortcut taken, every bias disguised as procedure, was suddenly exposed. What had been framed as ignorance was now unmistakably restraint. What they mistook for weakness was revealed as discipline forged under pressure most people would never survive. For him, the moment was both vindication and exhaustion. Relief washed in, followed by something heavier. The realization that none of this should have been necessary. That truth only mattered once it embarrassed the system. That dignity had been denied until credentials forced acknowledgement. The weight of the injustice settled over the room. This was no longer a simple case gone wrong. It was a mirror held up to a process that had failed before it even began. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was accusatory. As the implications sank in, one thing became clear. The outcome of this case would reach far beyond this man's life. It would challenge the credibility of everyone who had underestimated him. The case ended the way it should have from the beginning, with the truth acknowledged and the damage quietly undone. The charges unraveled, the narrative collapsed, and the record was corrected. On paper, justice was restored. He walked out of the courtroom free, his name cleared, his future intact. But what stayed with him was not relief alone. It was the memory of how close everything had come to being taken away because of assumptions made before facts ever mattered. Life returned to its routine, but it did not return unchanged. The discipline that once felt protective now carried a sharper edge. He understood, more clearly than ever, how fragile fairness could be when bias was allowed to guide decisions. Credentials had protected him this time, but the realization cut deep. Without them, the outcome could have been very different. The system had not corrected itself out of integrity. It had corrected itself out of exposure. The impact of that day extended beyond one man and one courtroom. It revealed how easily intelligence could be dismissed, how quickly dignity could be denied, and how often respect was conditional. This was not an isolated failure. It was a familiar pattern, repeated quietly in rooms where the power imbalance is rarely questioned. For many, there is no dramatic reversal. No moment where truth forces the room to stop and reconsider. If this story moved you, challenged you, or reminded you of something real, let it be heard. Share it. Talk about it. Add your voice in the comments, because silence is exactly what allows stories like this to repeat. What made this story matter was not the ending, but what it exposed along the way. The cost of prejudice is not always measured in verdicts or sentences. Sometimes it is measured in trust lost, confidence shaken, and the exhausting knowledge that being qualified is still not enough to be believed. He carried that lesson forward, not as bitterness, but as clarity. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, followed, and remembered, stay connected. Subscribe. Follow. Because the next story may not be his. It may be someone who never gets the chance to be believed at all.